14, starting in verse 19, then the angel of God, who was going before the host of Israel, moved and went behind them. And so up to this point, this pillar of cloud or fire, depending on what time of day it was, had been in front of them and had been leading them where to go. At this juncture, it moves, and it goes behind the people of Israel. The pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them, coming between the host of Egypt and the host of Israel. And so what this literally is God had their back. God positioned himself behind them so that the Egyptians couldn't get to them. And I think even a little more we'll see to obscure the Egyptians and prevent them from even being able to see them clearly. And so he moves behind them, coming between the host of Egypt and the host of Israel. There was the cloud and the darkness, and it was apparently at night that these things were taking place. And it lit up the night without one coming near the other all night. And so this happens. It lights the way for the Israelites, and it separated the Israelites from the Egyptians. That's what I understand from those things. I think I've got the verses that we're going to be talking about that should be coming up on the slide right there, I hope. Without one coming near the other all night. Verse 21, then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and made the sea dry land. Again, when did God act to deliver them as he had promised? Not until Moses obeyed. At the point that Moses did what God told him to do, God immediately springs into action and fulfills his promise. The waters were divided. They now have a way forward. He told them to go forward. Eyes would have told them they had nowhere to go. God showed them that they had a way through. And that's an important lesson as well. Again, we walk by faith and not by sight. We believe that it will turn out exactly as God has said. That's the way Paul puts it in Acts 27. I believe, God, that it'll turn out exactly as he has said. Doesn't matter how bad this looks. I know how it's going to turn out because God's told me the way it's going to turn. Well, God had told them what was going to happen. That they were going to be seen safely through, that the Egyptians were going to be destroyed, and that God was going to be glorified. And so God made that evident to them. He stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back. The waters were divided, and the people of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. What I can pretty much tell you is this was not the far end of the Red Sea where there was only water on one side of them. They had water on both sides of them, wherever it was. I've known some people, actually had a college professor that I debated this issue with quite strongly, that insisted it was a translation issue, that this actually was the area that is known as the Reed Sea, which is parts of the year dry anyway, and there was no miracle here at all. That's clearly not what's described. And so if you're going to take that position, then you need to throw the Bible out. It's untrustworthy. There was water. There was great amounts of water. It was piled up on both sides of them. The Egyptians, it says, pursued and went in after them into the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. And in the morning watch, the Lord in the pillar of fire and of cloud looked down on the Egyptian forces and threw the Egyptian forces into panic, clogging their chariot wheels so that they drove heavily. And the Egyptians said, let us flee from before Israel, for the Lord fights for them and against the Egyptians. Now, I'm going to stop here and talk about this a little bit because I think I mentioned last week, I grew up listening to people talk about the dust cloud that came up behind Israel as they crossed the Red Sea. I don't think that is supported by this text. I think what's supported by this text is that the seabed was still wet. And when the chariots of Egypt went into that, then the mud from the seabed began to cling to their chariot wheels and drag them down, made it very difficult for them to move forward. They began to panic at that point and realized that they were in trouble. Now, it's important to think about this in these terms. They're surrounded by water on both sides. Now their chariots are stuck in the mud. They can't go any further forward very easily. They can't get back out very easily. That would make me uncomfortable. And that's exactly what it's describing here. And so I think that's what we're supposed to get from this, is they were prevented from carrying out their plan. Their plan was to overtake Israel. How? Well, we have horses and chariots. We can move more quickly than Israel, and we can catch them. God saw that that was not possible by the way that He delivered Israel. And He used what would have been considered superior forces, superior technology, to actually hinder Egypt and prevent them from doing the things that they set their heart to do. And it goes on to say that in just a couple of seconds. Look in verse 26. The Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots, and upon their horsemen." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal course when the morning appeared. And as the Egyptians fled into it, the Lord threw the Egyptians into the midst of the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen, and all of the host of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea, not one of them remained. But the people of Israel walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. The photograph that you may have seen circulating on social media a couple of years ago of a chariot with a little skeleton in it, saying that they had found the remnants of the Egyptian army from the parting of the Red Sea, not a legitimate thing at all. Normal courses of things took place. The bodies floated into the seashore. They witnessed the deliverance of God. What might that do to someone? I want you to try as best you can to transport yourself to being someone who has spent their entire life in slavery, because this just generation, from the day they were born until this day, they had been in slavery in Egypt, who now are running from their owners. Their owners are behind them. The sea's in front of them. God parts the waters of the sea. They're able to cross. God closes the waters of the sea on their pursuers and kills them all. You're sitting there watching these things take place. What does that do to your mind? And how does that make you react? Would you be amazed? Would you be afraid of God and the power of God? Now, there is some fear of the Lord that we're going to read about in a moment. But it's really not very long. Literally, not very long. Before they go just a little bit out into the wilderness, Moses goes up on the mountain and they build a golden calf and say, "This is what delivered us." There's an important thing to realize here as well. And this kind of is, I think, parallel with a lesson at the end of the exchange between the rich man and Lazarus in Luke 16, where the rich man is convinced that if someone comes back from the dead, namely Lazarus, that he'll be able to convince his brothers to change their lives so that they don't have to be in torment like he is. And he is told they have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them. And he says, no, but that they would believe if one should come back from the dead. And the response is, if they don't believe Moses and the prophets, neither will they believe if one comes back from the dead. We have this mindset that if we only saw the miracles, that would be an open and shut case, and we would all have complete and total trust and faith in God and never doubt again and never make a mistake again, because we would know, because we had seen with our own eyes the power of God. You know what? It just doesn't work that way. These are the people of God. Why were they named Israelites, by the way? They were named after Israel. Who was Israel? That was not his given name. That was God's name to him. Anybody remember who it was? Jacob. Why was he given the name Israel? Because he wrestled with God. That's actually what the word Israel means. One who struggles with God. By the way, that is a foreshadowing name. These people struggle with God. So do we. The world doesn't struggle with God. The world ignores God. don't listen to what he says, they have no hesitation or problem. They have no struggle within themselves in trying to do what God has said. They just blow it off. It's the children of God that struggle with God, that have that, if you will, that late childhood, early adulthood attitude struggle of wanting to do what I want to do and wanting to resist people who have authority over me to tell me what to do. I don't want to blame it all on the teenagers. That's not fair, because it goes into your early 20s as well. We get a little bit more freedom in our early 20s usually. But the struggle is still there, where you're getting suggestions from your parents, you're getting suggestions from your teachers, you're getting suggestions from the state of what you should do and what you should not do, and you're struggling and saying, but that's not what I want to do. I want to do this, and I have a right to decide for myself what I want to do. That's the struggle. And we do that with God every day of our lives, where our will is in conflict with His will for us. Go forward, but I don't want to walk into the sea. Be baptized, but I don't want to be. I don't see any value in that. Live righteously and godly in the present age. Don't commit fornication. But I want to live by the mantra of if it feels good, do it. And I enjoy these things. I don't want to give them up. There's that struggle that goes on every day. These people were struggling with God. We continue to struggle with God. This is where we see these things unfolding. If we do what God says and we walk on the way that He has made for us, we're delivered just like He promises. If we fight against that, what happens? See, that's what we have to think about. And we have to realize some of these lessons that are being portrayed here. Our enemy is great, just like their enemy was great. They couldn't defeat the enemy by themselves. They couldn't make a way forward for themselves. God defeated their enemy and made a way forward, but He did it with conditions that they do what He said. And when they did what He said, then He made the way and made it clear for them. If they had struggled against that, by the way, they do that. After they cross over the wilderness, they get to the banks of the Jordan, and He says, go in and take the land, and they do what? They refuse. As a result of that, they are wanderers for 40 years and die in the wilderness instead of going into the promised land. Same group of people. When they obeyed God, they were delivered from their bondage. When they refused to obey God, they didn't receive the promise. And this is an important thing that we're seeing in this and how this all works. God is able to defeat enemies that are much greater than ourselves. The Bible is full of stories that show that. Look at the story of Samson. Look at the story of David and Goliath. Look at the Israelites and the Egyptians. I mean, just over and over and over again. Jericho, an impossible battle. We can't win, but we win because God gives us the victory. That is our struggle against our adversary, Satan. He's a powerful adversary. Does he have the ability to devour those in whom he seeks? Sure. But can we resist him? Yes, and we can do all things through Christ who strengthens us. We can successfully defeat our enemy if we listen to God and follow his will. That's one of the great lessons here. So, it goes on. They walked on dry ground, verse 29. The waters being a wall to them on the right. That I don't know, that would terrify me. That's a lot of water. And it's an east wind that's blowing that's making this happen. By the way, I think it was back in 2010, there was a group of scientists that actually did a computer model that figured out how this could be possible. following the exact text and recreating as close as they could the conditions, how this would be made possible. What I want us to understand is that doesn't mean it's not a miraculous thing. Because God used a wind doesn't mean that it's not an act of God. First off, does nature create that wind in its normal course? Well, it never happened before, and it's never happened since, as far as we know. So, no, that wasn't a natural wind. That was the air doing exactly what God desired it to do to accomplish a particular purpose at a particular time for a particular people. And that was something that only God could do. Moses didn't have the power to command the wind. He didn't have the power to command the waters. This is the same God who sets the borders of the ocean. This far shall your proud waves go and no further. This is the one who shut up the waters of the deep so that they don't cover the earth. We just studied about the flood a while ago and talked about the fact that there's plenty of water around to flood the earth. The reason that there's dry land is because God makes it so. He places the waters where He wants them, and that's where they stay. And we have another example of that set forth here. Then the waters return, destroy the Egyptian army, and they see all of the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Verse 31 says, Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians. Now, if it wouldn't have been scary enough to be walking through and having all that water surrounding you, knowing that you're not able to keep it back, if it was to come back on you, you're just out of luck. You get safely across, but then you see that water be released and go back to its normal place, and you see a bunch of people just like you have the very thing happen to them that you would be afraid might happen to you. That's what they saw. They saw the power of the Lord at work, and they feared the Lord for a little while. They believed in the Lord for a little while. Doesn't take very long for them to start saying, hey, wait a minute, it was better back in Egypt. Why'd you bring us out here? Let's just go back where the food's good. Doesn't take them long to get there. So they believed God for a little while and in His servant Moses. And so for a while they have confidence in Moses, but guess what they eventually start doing with Moses? Grumbling and complaining and making his life miserable and blaming him for all their problems. So they immediately upon seeing these things, fear God, believe in Him, and believe in His servant until circumstances change. And we have to be careful for that as well. Again, that we fall back on we walk by faith and not by sight. Our confidence in God and our confidence in God's promises should not be connected to our circumstances. We should be able to see through our circumstances and know that God will somehow provide a way, even if we can't see it at the moment. The Bible is absolutely full of examples of godly men and women who lived that way, who lived saying, well, I don't see how this is possible, but God has promised, so I know He'll provide. So anyway, that is the events directly related to the division of the Red Sea and the deliverance of the people of Israel. Now I want to change gears for a moment. Look with me at Joshua 3. For the record, Joshua 3 has absolutely nothing directly to do with the Red Sea. But I believe that this is a parallel picture. And it's extremely parallel. And we're going to talk about those things in probably not the time that we have today, because we're going to read this. So we're probably going to talk about and break down those things beginning next week, as far as just how integrated these two stories are and how they are teaching essentially exactly the same thing. In the first story at the Red Sea, it is God's delivery for them from their slavery and bondage to their liberty. This is actually the delivery of them from their liberty into their promise. And there are corresponding aspects of that to our very own lives. And so let's look at Israel. This is where, again, that generation, we know what happened to them. They refused to obey God. They wandered around aimlessly for 40 years, and they died in the wilderness apart from the promise that was made. The next generation arises. They now are going to follow God's command. And that's what we're reading about here in chapter 3 of the book of Joshua. Then Joshua rose early in the morning, and they set out from Shittim. And they came to the Jordan, he and all the people of Israel, and lodged there before they passed over. At the end of 3 days, the officers went through the camp and commanded the people, as soon as you see the Ark of the Covenant, the Lord your God, being carried by the Levitical priest, then you shall set up from your place and follow it. Yet there shall be a distance between you and it, about 2,000 cubits in length. Do not come near it, in order that you may know the way you shall go, for you have not passed this way before. And so this is important language. They are expected to behave in a particular way. What was in the Ark of the Covenant? Pot of manna, the staff that budded from Aaron, and this is the most important part, the Ten Commandments. Now, what was on top of the ark? The mercy seat. That's an extremely important thing. Where was the ark ordinarily kept? In the tabernacle, in a particular part of the tabernacle, in the Holy of Holies. And once a year, the high priest was able to, only once a year, the high priest was able to enter that area in order to make atonement for sins, because that is where God was. That's where you went into the presence of God to obtain mercy. What we have here is you don't move until God moves. When you see the Levitical priests who are assigned to carry the ark, carrying it, then you follow God. But don't get too close. You show some respect. And you stay back until it's 2,000 cubits away, so you can see clearly where you're supposed to go. Because you haven't gone this way before. We haven't walked in order to follow him. Now, that segues nicely into this morning's sermon. You shall be a distance between you about 2,000 cubits. Do not come near it, in order that you may know the way you shall go, for you haven't passed this way before. Joshua said to the people, consecrate yourselves. What's it mean to consecrate? To set yourself apart. You have a purpose now. This is not aimless, do what you want to do. You have a purpose. You now take yourself and set yourself aside for a purpose. Consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. Again, there's all kind of things that they have to do and commands that they need to obey, but who's doing the work here? God. God's the one who's doing wonders. God's the one who's making the difference. God's the one who's delivering the promise. That doesn't mean that they are not obligated to respond and to follow God in a very particular. Exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. Now remember what we just read at the end of the Red Sea crossing. After they saw what God did at the Red Sea, that is when the people knew that Moses was with God. They saw the power of God, and they feared God, they believed in God, and they believed in Moses, his servant. That's essentially what he's telling Joshua here. When these events unfold, these people are going to know that I am with you the exact same way that I was with Moses. As for you, command the priest who bear the Ark of the Covenant, when you come to the brink of the waters of Jordan, you shall stand still in the Jordan. Joshua said to the people of Israel, come here and listen to the words of the Lord your God. Joshua said, here is how you shall know that the living God is among you. Notice, one of the things that this is going to prove them is that God is there with them. Could they see God? Did they talk to God? The only person that communicated with God was who? Joshua or Moses, depending on which generation you're talking about. The rest of the people didn't hear God speak. They heard Joshua speak. But they're going to know that the Lord is with them, that He will, without fail, drive out from before you the Canaanites. Now remember, that's the I've given you this land. Go in and take it. You can have confidence because I've given you the victory already. They're going to know without fail that God is with you and that He has given you success over the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Havites, the Perizzites, the Girgashites, and the Amorites and the Jebusites. Behold, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth is passing over before you into the Jordan. Now therefore take 12 men from the tribes of Israel, from each tribe a man, when the soles of the feet of the priest bearing the ark of the Lord of all the earth, by the way, it says that multiple times here. God is not just the God of Israel. He's the Lord of all the earth. When the soles of their feet shall rest in the waters of Jordan, the waters of the Jordan shall be cut off from flowing, and the waters coming down from above shall stand in one heap. So when the people set out from their tents to pass over the Jordan with the priest bearing the ark of the covenant before the people, as soon as those bearing the ark had come as far as the Jordan, and the feet of the priest bearing the ark were dipped in the brink of the water, now the Jordan overflows all of its banks throughout this time of the harvest. And so this is a time of year when the Jordan was what? Flooded. So there's a lot of water. The waters coming down from above stood and rose up in a heap very far away at Adam, the city that is beside Zarethan. And those flowing down toward the Sea of Arabah, the Salt Sea, were completely cut off, and the people passed over opposite Jericho. I'm going to stop here for just a second. Is this the only way they can get into the Promised Land? And the answer is no. People forded that river in various places at appropriate times, all the time. They did trade with the other people in northern Africa. There were trade routes. There were different things that people moved around. There were ways to get through. The 10 spies 40 years earlier had gotten across the Jordan. God didn't do that then. So why is He doing it this way now? Okay, to demonstrate to this generation that He is there among them, so that they have the same fear of Him that the Israelites did, so that they understand that it's God who is giving them the land and they don't think they're doing it themselves, so that they know that Joshua is speaking for God and not for himself. And so there's a reason for all of this, so that they can see that what is happening is not by their might, not by their power, not because they're so good, but because God is delivering them. And if you read the entire book of Numbers, you'll find out that just before these events, He actually told them, okay, you're going to get in, but it's not because you're so good. Don't think that way. The priest bearing the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood firmly on dry ground in the midst of the Jordan, and all Israel was passing over on dry ground until all the nation finished passing over the Jordan. By the way, in appealing to the book of Numbers, what you find out is this group was actually bigger than the first group. The nation had grown in size over those 40 years. And so the entire time that this nation is passing, the waters are the Red Sea. I would suggest to you that there is some imagery that we're supposed to understand from this, and that it has application to other things. A comparison. Moses said, don't fear, stand still and see the salvation of God. He will destroy the Egyptians.